Silvia and Louise. Sylvia King is an enthusiastic empowerer of people, and I can certainly attest to that with the interactions I've had with Sylvia over the last month or so. She works with individuals and teams to help them flourish through coaching and positive psychology coaching and workshops. She holds 2 master's degrees, one from the University of Zurich and one from the University of East London, and has over 15 years experience in cross-cultural corporate context. And Dr. Louise Lambert is a Canadian registered psychologist who develops, delivers, and evaluates positive psychology and positive education programs for organizations and schools across the Arab Gulf region. Her peer-reviewed publications have been featured in the RAND Corporation reports and a report that I always enthusiastically and anxiously await for, the World Happiness Report. Her research areas include culture and happiness, the development of character strengths for youth, and positive psychology interventions for greater subjective well-being in the workplace. And with this, I would like to turn the stage over to Silvia and Louise as they talk about a different kind of happiness. Silvia and Louise, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Steve. And let me bring up the slides to get us started. Here we go. Good start. We're already happy. The
well
technology
done.
worked.
We've already got a bonus. Fantastic.
So thank you very much, first of all, Steve and Ann-Christine for hosting us, SIETAR Europa for hosting us tonight, and the wonderful introduction that you have given us. And thank you everyone for joining us. It's amazing, all the participants from all over the world. So Steve already told you a bit about who Louise and I are, so I'm going to skip this part and go straight into what we have in store for you over the next hours. Now we start by setting the stage. What is coaching? Coaching psychology, positive psychology. And we then start to look at how well-being might be different in the Middle East, but also positive psychology interventions, so-called PPIs. And we look at the specific concept, the fear of happiness. Now, when we then coach cross-culturally, there will be challenges and considerations specifically for the UAE and the Middle East. So we're going to talk a bit about that and give you a bit of an outlook where we might be going from here. And at the end, as Steve said, there's a Q&A for you. So post your questions in the Q&A section, please. So let's dive straight in. What is coaching? Just to give us a basis of what we're talking about here. So the definition for coaching is, it is a collaborative, solution-focused, result-orientated, and systematic process in which the coach facilitates the enhancement of life experience and goal attainment in the personal and or professional life of, and I like that, normal, non-clinical clients. So there's a lot in that definition, but the reason I'm putting it here is because we will be coming back to it throughout the presentation, because it shows you where positive psychology, coaching practice and coaching psychology connect. It also shows you how coaching is different from other fields. It is not mentoring, because the coach is only meant to facilitate. In the coaching space, we only have the coachee. And unlike mentoring, where the coach would be sharing their own experience, this is not meant to happen in coaching. And similarly, it's not therapy or counseling, because we don't work in coaching with non-clinical clients. Other things to consider about coaching are that it is a cross-disciplinary approach. And it draws a lot on psychology And unsurprisingly, coaching psychology is the science that underlies the practice of coaching and also draws on other fields like sociology. It's often also described as a form of self-directed learning. So the coachee gives the direction of the process, and it includes a conversational process, and it has positive psychology at its heart. Louise, do you want to tell us what positive psychology is?
Yes, I do. So thank you so much, and welcome everyone. So thank you, Silvia, for your beautiful explanation of coaching and positive psychology. The topic is definitely very dear to my heart. It is a branch of psychology. So if we could bold another word on this slide, it would be the word psychology. However, the field has been a little bit sidelined by the happiness industry, if you will. And so people tend to focus on the positive rather than the psychology part. But I really want to draw your attention to the psychology term there. So it is a branch like any other. In psychology, we have cognitive psychology, behavioral psychology. There's a whole bunch of different branches, and positive psychology is just one of those branches. So it is very much an empirical science. It uses the same scientific tools, measures, constructs, theories. However, these stem from a very different orientation, and that orientation is of well-being. So we really focus on not what makes life miserable, which, and I can say that I used to be a mainstream psychologist and we studied a lot of misery, but positive psychology does in part look at how do we reduce negative emotional states, but also, and more importantly, how do we add positive emotional states. And we do this at a number of different levels. So one is indeed focusing on the individual. So there, from that perspective, it's very similar to coaching. But we also look at the group level, social level, and then national level. And, you know, globally, we're certainly looking at that question as well. So here are things like, you know, the World Happiness Index would fall into that national or international level. The other thing is it's also very much, and here's again more overlap with coaching, is it very much focuses on human strengths and not so much human frailties. And it's not to say that frailties or distress or negative emotional experiences don't matter. We just think those are covered by other branches of psychology quite well, in fact, and really nobody's paying attention to well-being from a scientific perspective. So we very much focus on what goes well, what goes right, what makes people awesome, character strengths, and how do we continue to add what builds on that state. So yes, please go ahead. No, that's fine. So just to illustrate a little bit how it differs. So mainstream psychology, you know, I call it the science of doom and gloom, and it's largely what everybody understands psychology to be, the science of problems. And I'm definitely not minimizing these in any way. In fact, I think psychology has been very good at coming up with treatments and ways of mitigating, minimizing, and remediating a lot of problems that plague societies around the world. In fact, it's been fantastic. The criticism, though, is that it is incomplete. And so positive psychology really looks at not only how do we remove those things, but how do we actually add. So again, it's the presence of the positive. And this is a really important distinction to make. So I use my broken leg example. If your leg is broken, we need to fix it. It hurts and it's going to heal improperly. We put a cast on it. Great, that's the treatment. Then we take the cast off, it's now not broken, but it does not mean you are fit enough or strong enough to suddenly go and compete at the Olympics the very next day. That's a whole different set of training. That's a whole different set of contributors. That's a whole different set of factors or variables that we need to build in and strengthen so that you can go that extra, literally the extra mile in your race or whatever it is. So positive psychology very much looks at, again, what makes people be able to run marathons in the Olympics, just as an example. So again, looking at how do we build more positive emotional states, positive characters, positive interactions, how do we build meaning and purpose? And one of the ways in which we can do that is through what are called positive psychology interventions. Now, again, you see there's a huge difference between traditional interventions. Again, they work. I have nothing against these, but they work in a very specific way. So the chart on the left is really looking at traditional interventions. So this could be CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or just straight cognitive or uniquely behavioral therapies, or other types of therapies. And typically their goal is to reduce depression, as an example, or to reduce negative emotional states. Positive psychology interventions, and these are little tiny strategies that change how people think, how people act, how people interact, how people perceive the world, how people feel, how they can magnify those positive emotions, and also mitigate negative emotions as well. These are called PPIs, and they do two things. One is they decrease negative emotional experiences, and they also build states of happiness or well-being, if you will. So they do what I like to call double duty. There's a number of really good meta-analyses, one that just came out yesterday, which I posted on my LinkedIn, that is really showing that positive psychology interventions are very effective in reducing the negative and building the positive, and they are on par with traditional psychological approaches. So interesting stuff. And how does this fit back in with coaching? Silvia, back over to you.
Thanks, Louise, and thank you for setting the stage beautifully and explaining how positive psychology fits in with positive psychology coaching into a unified approach. So basically, positive psychology coaching integrates the science of positive psychology, of coaching psychology, and the coaching practice. But what makes it positive psychology coaching is not just using a positive psychology intervention, a PPI. So just a mere use of a PPI doesn't make it positive psychology coaching. What makes coaching positive psychology coaching is, one, the attitude of the practitioner, of the coach, who uses methodologies, a frame of mind, an attitude that is steeped in evidence-based positive psychology, some of the research that Louise just spoke about, but also positive psychology coaching typically has an explicit well-being focus. So it is not just a byproduct of coaching. Now, what are the well-being domains of positive psychology coaching? There is a model for it, hooray. It's called the RAW Model of Flourishing, and RAW is an acronym for resilience, achievement, and well-being. And we've been talking at the beginning about how coaching is cross-disciplinary, and that definitely is also true for the positive psychology coaching, because resilience tends to draw on clinical psychology, whereas well-being, as Louise just beautifully explained, is all about positive psychology. Then, interesting enough, there is achievement, which draws on coaching psychology and coaching practice. But what achievement is, what well-being is, these things are very subjective and context specific. And that becomes particularly relevant when we are working in cross-cultural contexts. And I think, Louise, that brings us straight over to you again.
So this is where things get interesting. As we know, a lot of the research that is done in psychology tends to be done in weird contexts. So if you haven't heard about this acronym came out a couple of years ago, and it's been used a lot since. And it's essentially looking at the fact, looking at where research stems from. And about 95% of all research in psychology stems from, I would say, the typical introduction to psychology university class in California. So blonde hair, blue-eyed, young 19-year-olds, that is largely where all the psychology research comes from. And that is problematic for a large number of reasons. One, it's very Western. The rest of the world isn't Western. By default, if we're looking at university students, they're educated. They see the world very differently than somebody who has a grade 6 education or none at all, because a lot of the research comes from the US, but also other Western countries as well. These countries typically are very industrialized, which means people have access to jobs, very modern societies. They tend to have a lot of affluence, access to money, and they tend to be very democratic. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that what ends up happening is that becomes the norm. That is what gets exported around the world, and that becomes the standard for normality. Now, that is problematic not only for the rest of the world, but it's even problematic within the US, within Canada, within Australia, within the UK, because of course, not everybody in those countries fits this either. So, this has been a problem for a long time. Psychology is well aware of it. On the plus side, though, what is becoming quite exciting is, as a result of all this criticism of the weird construct, there's a lot of activity going on in other parts of the world. So I am the editor of the Middle East Journal of Positive Psychology, that looks to sort of grasp the research in this part of the world, but there's other journals that have opened up around the world: India, Iran, Turkey, all over the place. And one of the reasons why I started the journal, I remember one of the first articles I tried to publish here, I sent it to an international journal, as everybody does, and the reviewer came back and said, "This is clearly not written by somebody who speaks English." I'm thinking, really? Okay. But that was just by virtue of where I was sending it from. And then the second point, which was probably the one that motivated me to start the journal, their comment was, "This has no relevance to our audience." And I thought, well, oh, that's interesting, because your stuff actually has no relevance for our audience. And so I've come to that conclusion. Many countries around the world have come to this conclusion, and that's been a really huge, wonderful benefit to the psychology research, in particular, positive psychology, because now the center of dominance, if you will, this has been decentralized. The internet has certainly helped, open source platforms for journals as well. This has certainly helped. And now we're seeing lots of research from all parts of the world really challenging this notion of well-being and what that actually looks like. One of these ideas is this notion of fear of happiness. So this is kind of an interesting construct, and it tends to show up in certain places over others, but certainly we see this all over the world and different points in history and in different groups. So you can probably see this in your own family history. This is not my family, by the way, some random internet photo. But if you even look at black and white photos from 100 years ago, there was this, everybody looks miserable, really. And I'd like to think they weren't that miserable, but there was this real sense of stoicism. And if you did not smile, this made you seem somehow more responsible, more mature, more regal in some way, more maybe higher up on the socioeconomic scale. And if we think of even kings, there's a reason why they never smiled either. I mean, you don't want the big toothy Instagram selfie smile that everybody's sporting today. This would really ruin your look as, a global conqueror if you're trying to scare people. So throughout history, we've seen this. Culturally, in other parts of the world, we see it as well. Sometimes it's culture, sometimes it's also gender as well. I've certainly noticed this in the region. You know, women are just as happy as men, of course, but the expression of happiness tends to look a little different. So sometimes ladies will cover their mouth and sort of temper their volume and not laugh as loud because it draws attention to them. People will look at them. People will start to, you know, say, oh, what are these ladies, you know, sort of cast judgment on them. So you know, sometimes it has to do with gender. Other times it also has to do with, you know, different philosophies in life, sometimes also different religions as well. So a lot of different philosophies, religions have espoused this notion of suffering, if you will. And, you know, there's this idea that, you know, God has put you on earth to test you. You have to earn your space in heaven. And, you know, part of carrying this burden is something that you do gladly and willingly. The other space where we see that people are kind of, you know, maybe have this fear of happiness can also be a little bit cultural as well. So, you know, in the region, there's a, you know, an expression, mashallah, and it's really, you know, may God protect you. And you'll say this to people. I mean, it would almost be considered rude to say to somebody, oh, your baby's beautiful, because you're calling attention to it, and that's calling bad luck. And so that would quickly be followed up with, may God protect you. So this is the notion of the evil eye. If you boast about happiness, but also good things. It could be good fortune, beauty, good news. You got a raise at work, a promotion. You're not going to say that too loud because, again, that's going to attract some negative attention. Other people have this fear of happiness because of the happiness industry. You know, it's like, yay, there's so much pressure to be happy that it makes people unhappy, actually. And so some people are really like, whoa, that's enough. Yeah, no thanks. It's a bit too much. So this has kind of also undermined the very thing that, you know, that we're trying to do. And then finally, you know, we have personality factors. I'll just leave that one right there. Yeah, happiness is not everybody's thing. So when we think about this construct of fear of happiness, what is it exactly? So it's a proper construct. There's a scale. This is Dr. Mohsen Joshinlu. He now teaches at the university. He's in South Korea. And he's the one who has come up with this construct, and others as well. Another one is the fragility of happiness. So this is kind of this idea that some people fear happiness. They legitimately fear it. If things get too good in life, it means something bad is coming. And so you don't want to be too happy, or certainly you don't want to show it too much, because you're really just going to undermine your own happiness that way. So lots of different studies have validated this around the world. Certainly we see it here. We also see it in other parts of the world, maybe to varying degrees. But I think what this really shows is that it sort of pushes back against the idea that everybody wants to be happy. No, they don't. Not everybody wants to be happy. And some people are actually actively disengaged from it and don't want it at all. So what does that mean for culture? And I'll turn that back to Silvia.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, and indeed, all of what you just pointed out, it has implications for how we then coach, how we apply positive psychology coaching, because actually an aspect, maybe, Louise, that you might could also talk about is positive psychology interventions. You know, we tend to go and just use positive psychology interventions. They have been validated in the West, And we just go and say, yes, of course, they make people happy. Let's use them in a different regional context. Do you want to talk maybe?
Yeah, so I just finished a study. We're still looking at the numbers, but one of the things we looked at is, so we know these PPIs work around the world. I mean, we know that. We've kind of moved on from that question. But what we're also looking at is what are the implications of using this? And so one of the studies I just finished doing was looking at the impact of using PPIs on subjective well-being, but also on culture itself. And what we found is that as a result of using PPIs, yes, it certainly made people happier. It also made them more individualistic. And so there's huge implications for culture, and practitioners, not only from elsewhere, which is kind of what happens in this part of the world, everybody's an expat, but even people who are from here who are trained using Western methods are doing the same thing, this copy-paste approach. And it's raising big ethical questions of, whoa, hang on a minute, do we have a right to make people happy at the expense of other factors that strengthen and make them happy, in this case, culture and family?
And perfectly illustrates the points I have on this slide, Louise, because we have several disciplinary influences, as we say, but they all come with their own cultural roots. And the people in a coaching conversation, they bring their own culture with them. So they see the positive psychology intervention, the process through their cultural lens. But we also need to consider, and I'm calling it places here, but it's the context in which we coach. Remember what I was saying earlier about the subjectivity and considering context. Because, for example, let's say we have somebody from the region here, say, for example, a Jordanian, but the Jordanian lives in Germany. So let's say this person comes for a positive psychology coaching session. So which culture applies? Am I coaching a Jordanian? Am I coaching a German? Is it somewhere in between? And what would be appropriate? And so questions to ask when coaching in non-weird context, and that specifically also applies to the Middle East, is thinking back at what we said at the beginning about what coaching is. So there is learning involved somehow, but how we learn, that process, that can be seen quite differently around the world. And also the role of the teacher, because we said that coaching is a process of self-directed learning. But if the teacher is a person of authority, of status, self-directing would actually be quite rude towards your coach. So really not something that somebody would naturally engage in from the region. And then we have in coaching a systematic process, which is very good, but which process are we using? Because we need to consider, who was it designed for? What are the underlying assumptions of the theories, the methodologies, of the tools that go into it? And then at the end of the day, who decides which processes to use? And last but not least, in coaching, it is solution focused, it is achievement orientated, but what actually is an achievement? In an individualistic culture, it would be self-fulfillment, personal growth. But how about in a more collectivist society? Contribution to a group can be an achievement in itself. It may not necessarily bring the self-fulfillment we would connect it with in a more Western context. So coaching industry has helpfully created principles that are supposed to help coaches and also positive psychology coaches in this context. So for example, the International Coach Federation has just recently updated their core competencies and put greater emphasis on culture and systems and contextual awareness. Whereas the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, they have a separate declaration that informs best practice or good practice when coaching in diverse and inclusive environments. Now, the challenge with all that is these are principles. Now, thinking back to the example of the Jordanian in Germany, how do I actually apply these principles when I'm sitting with the person in that coaching session? So the guidance is, yes, it gives you a good, large-ish framework within which to operate, but there's a lot of responsibility on the individual coach and practitioner in figuring out in the coaching session what that actually means and bringing a cultural sensitivity to the coaching session that is appropriate for this particular context. And what would be helpful for this practical situation would be some evidence-based, some research that could help us. And as Louise said, there is actually, Louise, do you want to talk a bit about how much positive psychology research we have available?
In the region, it's I mean, it's growing, but this is one of the issues, is that there's a lot of work going on. As you know, there's always the lag between, of research actually being published. I mean, I've been waiting on studies to be published. It's been 2 years. So I think there's a lot more that needs to happen. Certainly your recent paper that you've published in our journal outlines an entire model, but also looks at, how these competencies and these different principles line up. So I would certainly point to that. But is there a need for more? Absolutely.
Yeah. Because, I mean, we have little in positive psychology, we have even less in coaching psychology. And much of what we have has been written from the perspective of the coach. But we don't know much about how the coachees actually experience being coached, how they want to be coached, and what they consider appropriate. So this is where my study comes in that Louise just kindly referenced. And it looked at the question how Emirati Muslim coachees experience coaching. And the findings really focused on 2 broad areas of coaching. One was performance coaching, so where the coachee was looking to learn tools and skills that would allow them to improve in a particular area. So it could be getting promoted, improving their managerial skills. Often it was in work context. But what was interesting was how they saw the coach. And many mentioned, so I should also say it was a qualitative study with a small sample size, so we need more research to actually validate the findings of this study. Nevertheless, what this study indicated was that they chose the coach because the coach had experience in the particular field they wanted to improve in. And so the role of the coach extended to teacher, role model, and mentor. Now, if you keep in mind what I was saying at the start about the definition of coaching, you can see how this expectation of the study participants towards the coach creates a challenge for the coach, because the coach needs to go outside of their actual remit within the coaching definition and coaching frameworks. Now, another area of coaching was transformational or life coaching, that is more about personal growth. And a key element there, a key goal was to increase understanding of the self, but also of others, and gaining clarity. And we know from the positive psychology research that these aspects tend to be linked with well-being. So we might have actually potentially even an explicit well-being goal within the positives, within the coaching session. But again, this is something that needs to be explored further. But what was interesting when it came to the role of the coach, so again, they look to the coach to, as a role model, as a mentor, and as a self-learning facilitator, which is more the traditional coach's role. But it came with a twist, and the twist is related to mutual trust, respect, and sharing. And the emphasis really is on the mutual. Because if you remember, I was talking about how in a coaching session, the coach, basically the personality of the coach, the person of the coach stays out. So the coach wouldn't normally be sharing their own stories, experiences, opinions, or divulge too much about themselves. And yet, for these participants, for these Emirati Muslim coachees, the coach sharing stories about themselves and getting a feel for the coach was essential to creating trust. And that created the space in which they could explore and think about the goals of the coaching session. Now, this sharing and getting a feel for the coach also gave them a sense whether or not the coach understood their lived experience. So what is it like to be an Emirati Muslim here in Dubai? What is the reality of living this life? And feeling understood was really important, again, to feel respected, but also to create that trust. Now, what was created in this space was increased clarity and self-understanding. But what also became an interesting part of this process, where the coach was bringing themselves in, was that the coach was telling stories, and the stories that they told themselves often served two purposes. So it wasn't just to create rapport, to create understanding, to build trust. But in coaching, we have this thing called powerful questions. There are questions designed to make the coachee reflect, challenge them, and make them think maybe outside the box, reflect deeply. Now, the challenge with these questions is also that they can be quite direct. Powerful is good to trigger, but they can become across as disrespectful. So if stories were used instead of questions, and sometimes, so one participant gave an example where the coach was telling a story about, oh, that reminds me of a time when my uncle did this and that, and it seemed to have virtually no connection to the topic they were discussing. But the coachee went away, reflected on the message and the meaning in that story, and from the analogies the coachee found, created the self-directed learning that we would normally see during a coaching conversation, where you ask a powerful question and the coachee thinks out loud and the learning is created thus. So there are really some quite interesting differences, and it isn't really clear yet how can we integrate these differences into coaching, the coaching approach as we know it. So I could be going on about this for a long time, and I do apologize, but where do we go from here? Louise, do you want to talk a bit about where positive psychology is going?
Well, I can speak to positive psych and not maybe less to coaching, but just to give you a bit of a heads up as to what is going on and what is hopefully coming through the pipeline. So right now, I'm working with a team of researchers. We put forward a quite a huge grant and project, which I'm slightly terrified of, but I'm hoping that it will go through the Templeton Foundation. And we're looking at one question, and that is, what is well-being from an Islamic perspective? So for that, we're going to be doing lots of qualitative interviews. We're looking at, a number of different scales and constructs, and it's not necessarily to test, it's more to discover and uncover. And I liked, Silvia, how you put that. What is it like to live this life, and what does well-being look like here? And so we're hoping that, there will be commonalities. We know there will, but we're also hoping that there will be lots of distinctive differences that will add richness to this idea of global well-being. The other thing that you may want to know about that is actually headed up by Gallup, and the name escapes me suddenly. I'm very embarrassed. So I'm actually part of this initiative. It's called the Global Wellbeing Initiative. And part of that, it's an institution out of Japan, and they've partnered with Gallup. And in the Gallup World Poll, we will be changing some of the questions. So right now they're very Western. Gallup's in Washington, D.C. And the questions don't necessarily fit or capture everything we want to capture. So we've already run a new trial during COVID, looking at spirituality, religion, collectivism, individualism, relationships to family, to community, to society. So very much looking at what else can we learn about well-being through these questions. And Gallup does the world world poll, and I think there's 190 some countries, so it pretty much blankets everywhere. So this is going to yield a lot of good data, and there's a lot of researchers working on this, so we're going to start seeing lots of publications come out. Other two things I just kind of threw in for fun, but just to give you an idea that, positive psychology is not all about, just happy pizza pop parties, I call them, and although these are important, pizza's good. We are also very cognizant in this last year's World Happiness Report, looking very much more at systemic and contextual issues. And this has been a big criticism of positive psychology, that we just focus on the individual and we kind of forget that they live with other people. They live in a context, they live in a society, they live in a political system, they live in an ecological system as well. So there's been a lot of parallels drawn between sustainable development goals and well-being. The correlation is very high when countries commit to the sustainable development goals and take very practical, concrete actions towards that, which could include climate change, equality for women, education, health, and all the rest. People are happier. So this is one area that we're really looking at now. Dr. Catherine O'Brien, also fellow Canadian, is also heading up a huge research project looking at sustainable well-being. So how can people develop happiness and well-being, but in a way that respects the earth and balances happiness with climate action? So this is going to be some interesting stuff coming as well. So these are kind of the two big areas in positive psych now. It's context, environment, culture are the next big things. Silvia.
Maybe just a really quick whizzing tour through what's coming in the Middle East, because the problem is, as I said, there is not much out there, and so much needs to be done. So there aren't that many specific projects, but lots of questions where we still need to discover so much. And I've got, just based on, I'm not going through all of them, but you see some of the research questions that would be wonderful to explore, or just where my study maybe found some aspects. But we need to validate, like, what is the role of sharing stories? then the systemic aspect, as Louise just mentioned, is also becoming a lot more prominent in coaching in general. But it could also be really important here in the region because, as Louise pointed out, people aren't in isolation, and especially in more collectivist societies, we need to consider the system when we are working with the individual. Exploring the actual links between well-being and coaching and how the two really connect and can support each other. So many questions, and if there are any researchers out there, please do some coaching psychology research or coaching research in the region. It would be fabulous. I'd love to see more, and I'm sure we could all benefit to have the evidence base that helps us beyond the general principles. And with that, I think yes, Steve has come on my signal to finish and leave room for the questions of our audience.
Perfect timing, but you're not finished. We do have some, thank you so much for that fascinating walkthrough of coaching and positive psychology. We do have a couple of questions. One of them is kind of a biggie. What is happiness?
Oh boy, we're going to be here all night. No, actually, so I can take this one. I mean, I think science is getting really good at measuring happiness. So first of all, from a positive psychology perspective, we never use the word happiness. It actually doesn't mean anything. We use it in everyday language. You'll see it in newspapers, magazines, social media, but from a research perspective, we don't use that word. We use the word subjective well-being, life satisfaction. We might also measure it through the experience of positive emotion. So life satisfaction, subjective well-being is simply, are you satisfied with your life? That's the question. So there's three prongs. Are you satisfied with your life? How much positive emotion do you experience in any given period? I think it's like 7 days. And how much negative emotion do you experience in your life? Now, the goal is not to have zero negative emotional experience. That's not possible, but a balance where there's more positive than negative and people feel overall like they're satisfied with their lives. The experience of positive and negative emotions as well. So there are scales for all of this. Ed Diener, this is one of the most common scales, and these have been validated worldwide, even here in the region. They are available in Arabic. They're available in multiple languages. Now there's also other proxies for happiness, sort of substitutes, if you will. Sometimes we might measure meaning in life, in engagement. There's also another one I like by Corey Keyes, the mental health continuum. So do people feel like, a view on social well-being? Do people feel like they belong, they can contribute to society, they are respected in society? So there's a number of different ways to measure it, but happiness in itself, it's kind of like Jell-O. You can't really hold it. It doesn't have a shape. It's all over the place. But those constructs, very easily we can measure.
Just out of curiosity, my own curiosity, what kinds of differences do you see? What brings life satisfaction to people in, say, the Mideast area versus the weird parts of the world?
There's a lot of similarities. I mean, it's feeling like people like you, feeling like you can trust people, and you have good relationships and there's good supports in your life. Certainly, I mean, religion is a huge factor here, but it's important because it contributes to meaning and purpose in life, but other things can also contribute to meaning and purpose in life as well. So religion is one of them, but it could be your own personal values. It could be volunteering at a soup kitchen every day. That's also going to bring you meaning and purpose in life as well. Certainly, I've done a few qualitative studies on this, and definitely relationships, making other people happy, making parents proud of you, much more than maybe in the West, where it's making myself happy, focusing on my personal goals. So there are differences. And then at the same time, there's a lot of commonalities as well.
And I think what is also interesting in that context is not just what is happiness, but how do we express happiness? Because what Louise was saying earlier about the concept of fear of happiness, how do we express it when we are happy? So that, I think, is also a very important difference between West and the Middle East.
Yeah. Yeah, how it's displayed to the outside world, huh?
Yes.
Another question, can you give some examples of positive psychology interventions?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch. And they, when you talk about them, they sound kind of corny and they sound kind of lame, like gratitude, savoring, self-compassion, could be, values reflection. It could be, identifying and developing your character strengths. It could be, gosh, there's probably about 50 or 60 different ones. And, they're just simple little activities, and yet they have a huge impact. And, some people say, oh, but that's so simple. But CBT is simple as well. Write down your thoughts and challenge them. I mean, there's no big mystery in them. The power, though, comes from doing them. It's kind of like going to the gym. You don't just go once, but doing them regularly over time. You build it in as a habit. It becomes a lifestyle. And over time, that changes your view of the world, how you interact with people, what you assume, what you expect, changes your actions. And that's where the magic starts to happen.
And I think, Louise, you did a study about the fear of happiness and how it can be overcome in the region.
Yeah, so I do positive psychology programs for schools. And one of the things that I always measure is the fear of happiness. And one of the studies that we did was actually at university, and probably like 95% of the students were Arab, not necessarily Emirati, although we had a significant number, but mixed Arab from all over the region, and predominantly Muslim. The fear of happiness at the beginning of the study was super high. And then at the end of, so this was a 6-week program, different PPIs every week, but also teaching about happiness, but being open to other worldviews around what does that look like here, and really getting people to think about, what makes my life worth living. And what we found at the end relative to a control group, and also 3 months later, is that levels of happiness increased and they stayed there. Again, relative to students who didn't get anything, but also 3 months later, even after the program was done, but also the fear of happiness decreased. So part of it is, giving the strategies, but it's also about teaching, what is this? and letting people come to their own conclusions. And then people are less afraid of it, because now they're like, oh, I can do something about this. Yeah. Now what you choose to do, that's on you. But people realize the sense of self-efficacy. They can take control over how they feel and what they do.
We had a couple of comments in chat kind of related to that, is that people need to take self-responsibility in the coaching area, especially in coaching, to achieve their goals and reach their achievement, their desired achievements. We had also a comment in chat. A person has worked with executives in the Gulf area, and when he's tried to bring these PPIs in, he's gotten the reaction of, oh, that's so American. Have you also encountered that?
Yes, and I think, well, they are. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, they are. That's where they came from. And I think this is where, so I work really hard to, bring in philosophy. So there is Islamic well-being that does exist. This is a framework. This is a construct. And everything is in how you word and brings, it's how you sell it, really. And so, you know, I always start by the cultural piece, like what is happiness here? What does it look like? What is well-being? You know, how does that link to your values, your beliefs? And, you know, I think somebody said in the comments here, this idea of Islamic life coaching, I think. But yeah, it's not new. So there's a lot of, you know, segments of the Quran where this is talked about. There's a lot of Arab philosophers and Islamic philosophers. Again, this is not new. So, you know, we try to bring in a lot of that and just kind of marry it with science. And now suddenly it's not so foreign and weird and Western. So I think a lot of it is how do we frame well-being, because yes, it can be very alienating. People are like, you guys and all your weird it's like, no. Yeah.
And I think it brings us back to the context specificity, because, for example, Christian van Nieuwburg and Raja Allahu, they created the Ershad coaching framework, which is specifically designed for Islamic context. It's a theoretical framework, so it hasn't been tested, but it puts coaching into a framework that is aligned with Islamic teaching. So this can be a way of making it less Western. And I think, as Louise said, you know, it's about how do you frame it? So, for example, there was one study that looked, well, how can we bring something like gratitude naturally into the lived experience of people? And gratitude can be something that can be expressed as part of prayer.
Yeah.
So it's very simple. Or if we look at in the coaching context, the storytelling aspect and the looking for analogy, again, is something that we find in Islamic tradition. So if we have an existing tradition that uses storytelling and reflecting of the meaning of the story, why not use it in coaching?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, folks, it sounds like we could go on for a long, long time here. It's such a rich conversation. Unfortunately, our hour is over. Again, I want to thank Silvia and Louise for this great input, for sharing your experiences, your research, and giving us a little bit of hope of what lies ahead. Thank you very much. Again, folks, the recording will be up on YouTube within a day or so. And please check out the events coming up for SIETAR on our website. The next webinar itself is on the 18th of May. But before that, we've got coffee breaks, we have playgrounds. SIETAR España is running a film festival. There's lots and lots of good stuff going on in the SIETAR world. So check it out. Have a good rest of the day and hope to see you all again soon, and stay happy.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.